The relocation of Indian people to the cities, which was about relocation and assimilation, you know, on the part of the federal government to really eliminate Indian tribes by not developing the reservation, by removing, in many cases, the best and the brightest, you know, to the cities, and then basically using forced assimilation in order to undermine Indian sovereignty and Indian development. So the result being you've got, you know, thousands of Indians in the city, and the Indians in the city began to become very activists, and in one sense more activists than many of the brothers and sisters on the reservation, because in one sense they had less. You know, they didn't have their homeland with them, they didn't have their spiritual base with them, you know, they didn't have the security, you know, of the reservation. So in a very less secure environment, there's more anxiety, there's more frustration, really. And the urban groups began to speak out, became more activists, and sort of led, in the late 60s and in the early 70s, the strong activist movement that emerged. You know, takeovers of BIA buildings, of missile sites, of forest preserves, of government buildings, you know, as a way to demonstrate that the off-reservation population were Indian people too, and deserved to be recognized and deserved to be served by the federal government, at least on some kind of equitable basis based on their numbers in the cities for particular services, education, employment, health, eventually in child welfare, all these areas. So those of us that were sort of in the forefront of the movement were all very closely working together, you know, as a network, as actual network. Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity was very active. So they were one of the leaders. Americans for Indian Opportunity and LaDonna Harris's organization out of Washington, D.C. So the National Indian Youth Council, American Indian Movement, all those groups were actually, most of them were a part of the National Lutheran Board, and either were on the board or our board members were on their board. So this body, this board, actually became one of the largest financing mechanisms for getting Indian tribes to Washington to testify on issues, for organizing and getting advocacy behind major legislation, for helping to create a network of Native activists and organizers, and paying for their travel and for their work to support you know, Indian issues. And then we had sort of the leading Indian political activists and philosophers like Vine Deloria completely supporting this. Had been executive director of NCAI and was pushing actually for urban groups to have equal power, at least in terms of participation within the National Congress of American Indians, and to be members of National Congress of American Indians, because Vine recognized that you had to have this political base behind Indian sovereignty to protect it, because it's always in jeopardy. And it's always threatened by Congress, which holds the pen, and the President of the United States, so you always have to hold them accountable. So the largest political force that you can build to hold them accountable, the more sovereignty is going to be secure, you know. So Vine was a strong advocate for urban groups. He supported the urban activism. You know, he testified in support of it in trials. He supported it through NCAI. He supported a grant through the Ford Foundation to the National Congress of American Indians to actually help create Indian centers across the country. So as the groups began to be activists, the government responded, and there was support from some reservation leaders, and particularly those who realized that you can't separate yourself from your growing political base. If the majority of your people are being relocated to the city, you've got to reconsolidate your political base, and you can't separate yourself from that base. So there was strong support from some of the more knowledgeable political reservation leaders who worked with some of the urban activists. And there were a series of hearings that were held across the country not just on reservations, but in cities. And those hearings did a legal analysis that pointed out that the basis to the services that the Bureau of Indian Affairs provides to Indian people goes back to the Snyder Act. And the Snyder Act doesn't mention tribes. What it mentions is services to Indian people all across the country. And so if that was the basic legislative foundation on which the Bureau was defining its services to Indian people, it couldn't define it strictly on the basis of tribes. Nor could the federal government define those services strictly on the basis of tribes. So that issue was pushed, and there were threatened lawsuits. When I was working in Phoenix with Southwestern Indian Development, we actually contacted NUIFC, and we told the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we actually went down and demonstrated at their offices in Phoenix and said, we demand education services in Phoenix, you know, for off-reservation Indians. You're providing them only to reservation Indians. We deserve education services as well based on the Snyder Act. We're working with NUIFC. We're going to file a lawsuit against you. And the result was the Johnson-O'Malley Act. And the way that came about, though, was the Bureau kind of tried to go around it. In other words, they ran the Johnson-O'Malley money through the state, you know, and instead of running it directly initially to Indian organizations, they ran it through the state. And so that's how Johnson-O'Malley money sort of ended up going to the state before Indian education money started coming directly to Indian organizations in the city. But that was one of the breakthroughs. And then demonstrating again locally and regionally and nationally with these federal agencies saying, you know, we deserve to get money from the Department of Indian Education. Just as all these other departments were opening up to tribes, the urban groups were being activists and organizing and pushing for those same services from the Department of Education, Labor Department, and all these ANA, all these other agencies, simultaneously with tribal self-determination being recognized and expanded beyond the Bureau. We were organizing, following that in every federal agency and saying we deserve services too, based on the Snyder Act, based on other precedents that are being set by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and by actually the needs of the people in the urban area. And we're able to get our elected officials who were actually representing more people in the urban area behind us. So when we went to the Department of Education or Department of Labor and said, we expect to be in the legislation too, we had the congressional people from those districts, in the urban areas supporting us. And so legislation started to be written with not just these tribal, but Indian organizations and Indian people elsewhere within every piece of legislation. So that the thing just sort of went from there to build, you know, an Indian urban movement. And eventually within ANA, and I was organizing with Indian centers as well, became the director of an Indian center. We were able to get ANA to specifically designate Indian centers as a recipient of ANA funds. And as a result of that, the urban Indian center movement sort of mushroomed. And eventually there was like 70 urban Indian centers funded, core funded by the Administration for Native Americans all across the United States.